All right, so my name is Naseem Nobari. I'm a co-founder of Seed the Commons, which is a small grassroots organization based in San Francisco. So Seed the Commons, focuses on transforming our food systems and in particular fighting corporate takeover of food systems and promoting alternatives that are just, sustainable, and also regenerative when it comes to agriculture. We do believe that agriculture can be a means of ecosystem regeneration, that it is really fundamental to addressing many issues, including climate change. And you know, over the years where we were focusing on that, we were, seeing that a lot of the narrative around alternatives to corporate agriculture sort of became dominated by this notion that we needed more grazing, more animal husbandry, and so that's something that we've always disagreed with. And so that's something that we've been, here and there, we've uh, sort of taken position against it, spoken out against it. And so we were actually uh, doing other things for a while. So Seed the Commons actually was on pause for a good while. And a number of things were happening in the world that made us think, okay, we need to get back to this work. And one of those things was that last year, COP30, which is the climate summit that happens usually every year. Um, COP30 was going to take place in Brazil, and they chose the location, Belém, precisely because they wanted to focus on the importance of rainforests and rainforest protection when it comes to, our climate crisis. So that was coming up, and the primary driver of rainforest degradation, of deforestation in the Amazon is grazing. And we thought, well, this is something that needs to be mentioned there, probably won't be. There are already so many, it's already difficult to get fossil fuels on the table. And so that was one of the things that sort of pushed us to come back to this work. And so we went not to COP30 itself. Well, we didn't participate in what's called the blue zone of COP30, where the negotiations are happening. But we went and we participated in the Peoples Summit Towards COP30, which was a sort of parallel event organized by grassroots organizations from around the world, but especially Brazil. And we had actually already been to an event like that when we founded Seed the Commons. We went to COP15 in Copenhagen. Back then, Seed the Commons had been founded in Switzerland. So we took the train and the boats and all that up to Copenhagen, and we participated in a very similar type of uh, event. And so, we participated in the People's Summit Towards COP30, and we were able to go walk around the green zone of COP30, which is open to the public and where various countries, various companies, various large nonprofits have their stands, and, they talk about their proposed solutions. We went to the agri-zone, which not many people have spoken about, but the agri-zone was set up by large um, you know, food agribusiness companies like Bayer, Nestle, and that was a large zone that was bigger than the actual COP30 that was set up basically next to it. So they had their own parallel thing going on. So we went there. And we also, Chema and I, Chema, who is helping in the background today, we were able to stay in the indigenous village that was set up by the Brazilian government to help indigenous people, both from Brazil, but also other countries, to participate. So, so this whole webinar series is sort of a follow-up to that, and we're going to speak about all these experiences, our takeaways. Do we think that these sorts of events really help towards the solution or not? We're going to speak about all of that on February 28th. So right now, as part of this follow-up, we're deepening this question of grazing in the Americas because that's something that we spoke about in Belém. Last weekend, we had two panels that sort of delved into various aspects of this, and we want to give people a sort of broader view of how the issues in Brazil are connected to the issues in Mexico, are connected to the issues in the US. They have similar historical sort of developments. And so, as part of that, we've invited Erik Molvar, who is the executive director of Western Watershed Project, to join us today to speak about grazing in the American West. Um, so I'm very happy that he was able to join us. And so he's going to give a presentation. We're going to open it up after to Q&A. If you have questions, please type your questions in the Q&A section, not in the chat, because it's easier for us to follow in the Q&A. So type your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll get to them after Erik's presentation. All right. So Erik Molvar is a wildlife biologist and executive director of Western Watersheds Project, a nonprofit environmental conservation group that works to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. His scientific publications include a comprehensive review of cheatgrass invasion literature, as well as peer-reviewed studies on moose predator-prey interactions, effects of herbivory on soils and vegetation, and moose population dynamics. He is also the author of 15 guidebooks to Western public lands, including national parks and wilderness areas. All right, thank you so much, Erik. I'll let
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Nasim. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully you can all see my first slide. So today we're going to talk about, the title of my presentation is Beyond the Regenerative Myth, the reality of public land ranching in the American West. And we're going to talk about livestock grazing on public lands west-wide first, mostly in the interior West. And then we're going to zoom in on Point Reyes National Seashore, where Western Watersheds Project is one of the plaintiff groups that has been working to transition agricultural landscapes to native coastal prairies. Ranching in the American West really has its roots in the philosophy of dominionism. This is a painting by an artist by the name of John Gast from 1872 called American Progress, really encapsulating the idea of manifest destiny and dominionism and American imperialism in the West. And it's a settler colonial construct in which white Euro-American settlers moving west into lands that were inhabited by indigenous peoples that had been living there for tens of thousands of years, claimed these lands by right of conquest, sometimes treaties, um, and cleared the indigenous people off the land. They cleared a lot of the native wildlife off the land. You can see in this painting, the buffalo are fleeing, the wolves are fleeing, the indigenous people are fleeing, and in their place comes progress as defined by the dominant culture, which was industrial development, agricultural development, and the idea that the land was really there for the exclusive use and benefit of modern society, and it didn't have its own value. So that is the underlying philosophy that underpins Western public lands ranching. The idea that that ranching itself can tame the wilderness, make the land productive, is a value in and of itself, and cancels out all the other values that it are left degraded in its wake. We're going to start with a slide of healthy native bunch grasses. And this is from the Idaho National Laboratory. This is an area that is ungrazed by livestock because it's part of experimental nuclear testing facilities. And this is what the interior West, even the arid parts of it, used to look like. And if you've traveled across the American West today, you'll see a landscape that has a lot of bare ground, a lot of kind of grasses mowed down to their very nubs. That's not normal. This is the normal and natural state of affairs. This is what it looks like when you just have the native herbivores out there, the elk, the mule deer, the pronghorns, grazing on the native grasses. And you have healthy native bunch grasses that are abundant, that represent the natural suite of vegetation that is native to the region. In the more arid parts of the Great Basin, you have biological soil crusts. And if you've traveled to places like the Colorado Plateau, Bryson and Zion National Parks in southeastern Utah, parts of western Colorado, you'll see these signs that say, don't bust the crust, stay on the trail, because one human footprint can result in impacts on these biological soil crusts that can last for decades. And biological soil crusts are made up of fungi, mosses, and blue-green algae. They're a very complex suite of soil organisms that not only help rainfall seep into the soil instead of running off, but also importantly fix nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. And that is critically important because nitrogen is the building blocks of protein, critical for plants, critical for the animals that graze them. Once you lose these biological soil crusts, you lose soil productivity. It leads to desertification, and you have less productivity for every species of herbivore that's out there. So it's a long-term ecological impact. And of course, cattle and sheep in high densities graze on these areas. They're trampling these soil crusts, and they're causing impacts that last 30 or more years. And in most parts of the interior West that are heavily grazed by livestock, you have no biological soil crusts except in a few relict spots beneath the shrubs where the livestock are unable to trample them. One of the biggest problems with cattle in the American West is that cattle are not native here and they are not well adapted to arid environments. Cattle evolved in the boggy forests of Northern Europe. And so when you put them out into a desert, they gravitate to water. They will not eat farther than 2 miles from a water source. They concentrate their impacts within 1 mile of a water source. And if they're given a choice, they will spend most of their time in what are called the riparian areas, the deep soil, high productivity vegetation that along stream courses and stream channels. These are the biodiversity hotspots, the oases of the desert. But the cattle gravitate to them, mow down the vegetation, destroy the vegetation, and wipe out the biodiversity. So that's a major issue. When cattle concentrate in these riparian areas, they are not shy about urinating and defecating in the water. And as a result, they're major sources of water contamination. Western Watersheds Project has sent field staff out to take a look at the amount of fecal coliform in waterways on public lands. And we are finding very commonly levels of fecal coliform that are many times the Clean Water Act standard for what's safe for human contact. So if you're out on public lands, you might be very cautious about letting your children play in the water. Don't drink downstream of the herd. These things can lead to E. coli poisoning, which is very serious illness. In addition to the impacts to the water quality itself, the heavy grazing along the riparian areas leads to erosion and siltation in the waters and very turbid waterways. In the interior West and along the West Coast, many of the native species of trout and salmon are very sensitive to both water turbidity and also siltation. And the reason is that they tend to spawn on spawning gravels. They dig nests called redds in the spawning gravels themselves and then bury their eggs in the gravel. They're depending on the flow of water through the gravels to oxygenate the eggs and help them survive. And meanwhile, the eggs are kept safe from predators. Well, what happens when you have heavy erosion and siltation is the spawning gravels get smothered by the silt. The water doesn't flow through the gravel anymore. The eggs are in stagnant water that lacks oxygen and they die. And that is the source of a lot of the trout and salmon and steelhead losses across the arid West. Many, if not most of the species of trouts, of native trouts that are in the desert Southwest, in the interior northern cold deserts of Nevada, Idaho, and Wyoming, on up into Montana, are either on the endangered species list or deserving of endangered species listing. And the siltation of the waterways in the low elevations, primarily due to cattle, up in the forest areas due to heavy logging, are what the primary drivers are of their extirpations. One of the biggest ecological crises facing the West right now is the crisis of the invasive weed cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is not native to North America. It comes from Europe. It was brought over in contaminated wheat. It was spread along the railways in weed seed contaminated bedding for stock. And once it got established along the railroad rights of way, then cattle and sheep took those seeds and carried them into the interior and spread them everywhere. Now, cheatgrass cannot by itself really get established in the face of healthy native grasses because the healthy native grasses outcompete cheatgrass when they're adults, for nutrients, for soil moisture. So the cheatgrass is unable to get established if you have a healthy grasslands or a healthy sage steppe or other such native vegetation. But once you overgraze the native vegetation and you create a disturbed environment, you get cheatgrass moving in. And cheatgrass is an annual weed. It lives for 6 weeks in the spring when it's green. So it grows from a seed, sometimes sprouting in the early fall and overwintering as a basal rosette, sometimes sprouting in the springtime. For 6 weeks, it's green, growing, set seed, drops its seed, and then dries out, dies, and it's just basically tinder dry for the rest of the year. So essentially, once you get heavy livestock grazing, you have created the ecological switch that causes the transition between healthy native grasslands and cheatgrass infested understories. Once that takes place, the cheatgrass burns. That wipes out sagebrush and all the other fire intolerant plants in the ecosystem and trends the ecosystem toward ecological monoculture. This is the literature review that I conducted together with botanists Roger Rosentreter and Don Mansfield and Greta Anderson, also from Western Watersheds Project staff. And we looked at more than 500 studies of cheatgrass. And what we found was that there's a very clear straight line causal link between heavy livestock grazing and cheatgrass infestations, not only because livestock grazing is the disturbance that causes most cheatgrass infestations, but also because cheatgrass has these sharp seed heads that lodge in the fur of curly-haired animals like cattle, like domestic sheep, and then gets carried to new places. So they're actually hitching a ride with the livestock hosts, which are then inoculating the rangeland with these non-native seeds. And here is the URL. You can also Google Western Watersheds cheatgrass and find it online and read for yourself if you're interested in learning more. The livestock industry would like everyone to believe that cheatgrass is the legacy of heavy overgrazing 100 years ago during the Dust Bowl. This is simply not true. If you look at these two maps, in the center you have the map of cheatgrass distribution in 1990. You have the cheatgrass distribution in 2018, 18 years later, showing a market expansion in the extent and intensity of cheatgrass infestations. This is a current growing problem today. It's due to today's livestock grazing that's being authorized by the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. And the livestock industry doesn't want to take ownership of this one. It's doing everything it can to avoid accountability for the cheatgrass infestations. But in fact, it's domestic livestock and no other cause that is the cause of these cheatgrass infestations. And the best case scenario for getting rid of cheatgrass is reducing or eliminating the livestock. Here on this pair of photographs, you see two photographs that I took in 2023 in the Salmon River allotment of northeastern Nevada. This is an area that has livestock grazing. Also, there are native herbivores like mule deer and up in this area and pronghorn. There aren't any wild horses as it happens. The livestock industry likes to scapegoat wild horses for cheatgrass infestations. Not true. But on the left, you see outside the exclosure, the grazed area, you have sagebrush and rabbit brush, and the entire understory is cheatgrass, these kind of purple seed heads. And you can't even find a trace of native bunch grasses outside the fenced exclosure. To the right is what it looks like inside the exclosure that was set up 5 years before the photo was taken. And so for 5 years, that was protected from domestic livestock. And inside this photograph, you see tall native bunch grass bunches growing. You see Indian rice grass. You see blue bunch wheatgrass. You see squirrel tail. All of these native grasses are coming back. All it took was to subtract the cause of the disturbance from the landscape. And somehow there were enough native seeds left in the seed bank to bring this back by itself. This is an area that was not seeded artificially by the BLM. It's just natural seeding. This is a map of cheatgrass throughout the American West. In the purple areas, those are wild horse herd management areas. You often hear the livestock industry complaining that wild horses are overpopulated and they're degrading the range. So we did a little analysis to see exactly what the trends are for cheatgrass inside the wild horse herd management areas and outside where only domestic livestock were grazing. And what we found that was that in virtually every category of cheatgrass cover, there was more cheatgrass outside the wild horse areas than there were inside the wild horse areas, even though those wild horse areas are also grazed by domestic livestock. Now, this is correlation, it's not causation. This is not a critical test of the hypothesis, but it does indicate that the biggest problems with cheatgrass are not correlated with wild horses. And they are correlated with areas that are ungrazed by wild horses. And so domestic livestock are the primary grazer out in those areas. Range fires often follow the cheatgrass. And as noted before, once you get these big fires, they wipe out the sagebrush because sagebrush do not stump sprout once they're burned. And so they have to reseed. That takes sometimes a century when it comes to Wyoming big sagebrush and some of the more arid types of sagebrush in the lower basins. But in areas that burn and are not overgrazed by cattle, you get the recovery of healthy native bunch grasses in the wake of fire. So when you hear the talking point that cheatgrass is caused by fire, remember, if you start with healthy bunch grasses in the understory, this is the Idaho National Laboratory again, a part that has burned. And coming up in the wake of fire, you see blue bunch wheatgrass, you see rabbit brush. You're going to see sagebrush eventually coming into this area. It's going to take a long time, but already this is an area that was resistant to cheatgrass invasion because it had the healthy native bunch grasses as its starting point. So fire itself does not cause cheatgrass. It's the livestock grazing that's the ecological switch. One of the things that happened a lot in the interior West over the course of millions of acres were there are a lot of areas that were subjected to what are called rangeland treatments. Some of those treatments included mowing down the sagebrush because sagebrush were thought to compete with the grasses. And if you could get rid of the sagebrush, you could have more grasses and more food for the cows. So they treated millions of acres doing that. This photograph shows seeding of crested wheatgrass and Siberian wheatgrass, two non-native and in fact invasive types of bunch grasses that are often planted in order to support livestock because you can get up to 8 times the cattle productivity by seeding these non-native bunch grasses like a crop. These non-native bunch grasses are extremely poor quality vegetation for native habitat and native wildlife. They are better for the livestock industry. It does basically turn the range into an invasive weed infested ecological wasteland. I'm going to show you a few photographs from a study by Batchelor and others in 2015 from Heart Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. And this was a refuge that in the early 1990s was closed to livestock grazing. You're going to see paired photographs. On the left here, you see one from 1988 when the area was being grazed by livestock. And Batchelor and others came back in 2013 and took a photo of exactly the same spot in 2013 after this area had been closed to livestock grazing for 20 years. And you can see the recovery of this riparian area along this stream side. Here is a wetland in 1987 on the left that during the time in which you had cattle grazing, you can see how heavy the impacts were on this wetland. And then coming back 25 years later, 26 years later, you see what the wetland looks like today from exactly the same vantage point, and you see the recovery that you can achieve by removing the native or removing the non-native livestock. On the left, again, another wetland that was heavily damaged by livestock. This photo from 1989. On the right in 2013, 24 years later, that wetland is now recovering. The difference is they have subtracted the domestic livestock that were there. And this has a major impact on the native herbivores as well, because the native herbivores are the ones who are trying to survive on the vegetation that's out there. The livestock industry typically gets to have forage utilization of 50 to 65% of all of the vegetation growing between January 1st of the year and December 31st of the year. In other words, half or more of the livestock forage is designed to go into cattle or sheep, leaving the native species with the remainder. This has a population level impact. This chart is based on statistics from a USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service publication from 2007 by Ogle and Brazil, showing that one cow-calf pair, which is the measure of livestock grazing in the West, eats as much forage as 2 elk or 7 mule deer or 10 pronghorn. So every cow-calf pair you put out there is competing with the native wildlife. And if you wonder why there once were tens of millions, maybe 100 million elk, or I'm sorry, 10 million elk at the time of Lewis and Clark, and now there are only 1 million. Livestock are to blame. If you wonder why there might have been 40 million mule deer, and today mule deer are getting scarcer and scarcer and scarcer, domestic livestock are taking their forage. And if you take a look at this next graph here, this is a pie chart that was published by the Bureau of Land Management showing their forage allocation for domestic livestock, feral horses, and wildlife on the Lakeview district in Oregon, in Eastern Oregon. And by design, the Bureau of Land Management has allocated 86% of the forage out there to livestock. Whereas if you look at the native species, they're getting collectively less than 15%. And feral horses are allocated 2% of the pie. And so it is functionally impossible to attribute the rangeland health problems that we're seeing today throughout the West to any source other than livestock because they're taking the lion's share of the forage. They're doing the lion's share of the impact. Now, one of the sensitive species of wildlife that has been declining across the American West is the greater sage grouse. And on the right, you can see the long-term declines of greater sage grouse. And the most recent publications show that these long-term declines at every time scale, whether it's the recent scale, the midterm scale, or the long-term scale, this species is still declining. And very a very specific amount of the sage grouse range in western Wyoming, in parts of southeastern Montana, and parts of northeastern Wyoming have heavy oil and gas development. Some parts of western Colorado, some parts of Utah. There are vast areas of western Utah, of Nevada, of Idaho, of Oregon, of northeastern California that have essentially no oil and gas development at all. And livestock grazing is the principal and primary human impact in those areas. Now, there used to be an estimated 16 million sage grouse in the United States and Canada before we got started with Western colonialism, the livestock industry, the oil and gas industry, and all the other impacts that affect sage grouse. Today, there are perhaps 200,000 of these birds left. They deserve to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. For political reasons, they're not. And the biggest, most widespread cause of sage grouse declines is domestic livestock grazing. That is the human impact that has changed the land from the reference conditions at the time of Lewis and Clark to today across the vast majority of the sage grouse range. And one of the big contributors to this turns out to be barbed wire fencing. Sage grouse fly very low and they can't see barbed wire fences. And so they collide with the barbed wire fences. And one Wyoming Game and Fish study showed that 146 sage grouse were killed along a single 4.7-mile stretch of fence in western Wyoming over the course of 2 years. 146 sage grouse, one less than 5-mile stretch of fence over the course of 2 years. Imagine what the total looks like over the course of the 660,000 miles of fencing that are stretched across the American West. So fences are a major ecological impact. They are only there because the livestock industry needs to have them, and they are a hidden cost of domestic livestock grazing in the interior West. Fences are also a migration barrier. Elk can usually jump over them. Pronghorn have much more difficulty. The pronghorn here that you see in this photograph trapped in the fence, we were able to take that pronghorn and cut cut that fence and get that pronghorn out of the fence. That pronghorn was unhurt, but pronghorn mule deer commonly get hung up in these fences during the course of their migrations and can die there because they can starve to death. Another of the collateral issues of livestock grazing is feed grounds. And this is an exclusive problem to the northwestern corner of Wyoming, but it's an important problem because the northwestern corner of Wyoming is where Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park are located. And so if you look at where you are concentrating these animals in these feed grounds, and you look at the spread of a new disease, which is a mad cow-like disease that probably originated from a disease called scrapie, which is a brain prion from domestic sheep, has spread out of northern Colorado into Wyoming and now is getting into these feed grounds. And these feed grounds are essentially super spreader sites for chronic wasting disease. The livestock industry insists on having these feed grounds in northwestern Wyoming, in large part to keep the elk off of private ranch lands that are their native winter range, and because the domestic livestock industry has been overgrazing the Forest Service lands that where the elk might otherwise winter and have for their winter habitat. So now instead of reducing the amount of cattle grazing and allowing enough native forage to be out there for the elk to get through the winter, they concentrate them at these feed grounds and kick out hay to feed them all winter. And it's a major risk factor where chronic wasting disease is probably going to metastasize in the northwestern corner of Wyoming, move into the Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park elk herds, and probably decimate those herds. And that is a major ecological hotspot that people come from all over the world to view. That's going to be missing some of its important native species, elk, mule deer, and moose in large measure because of chronic wasting disease. Another disease that's really important is the sheep disease, Pasteurella hemolycta and Mannheimia pneumoniae. These two diseases are like HIV for domestic sheep and pneumonia all wrapped into one. Once there is a single nose-to-nose contact between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep, the bighorn sheep are really not resistant to it. The domestic sheep can carry it and not have a health problem. The wild sheep take that disease back to the herd and it wipes out entire herds, principally by killing the lambs and making sure that the lamb crops fail year after year after year until the herd dwindles away. It's such a severe problem that when these diseases are detected in wild bighorn sheep herds, the game and fish agencies come in to kill off the entire herd to keep it from spreading. That's how bad and serious this disease is. The solution is to keep domestic sheep away from bighorn sheep with a distance of at least 15 miles. That's the foray distance for the young rams that are out looking for love during the breeding season. Here you see a female bighorn sheep mingling together with the domestic sheep in a grazing allotment in Colorado. They're very curious about each other, and that's a big problem. So we have to keep these species separated, but right now the federal agencies aren't doing a very good job of that. Eradication of large native carnivores is a big part of the livestock industry's history in the American West. And the reason that wolves and grizzly bears were driven extinct in the case of wolves and driven so close to the brink of extinction that they were only found in national parks like Glacier and Yellowstone for a time was the livestock industry. The livestock industry came out west with these really vulnerable large herbivores that fit the prey image of both grizzly bears and wolves. And the wolves and the grizzly bears found easy pickings. And why wouldn't they? That's their natural job, is to eat herbivores. And in response to this, the ranchers in retribution had entire campaigns where they had shooting, they had poisoning, and they wiped out many of the species. Coyotes have been a particular target of the livestock industry, but instead of making coyotes rare, coyotes just spread after this. It used to be coyotes were primarily found in the American West. Once the ranchers and the farmers started trying to wipe out the coyotes, what happened was they started breaking up the complex social structure of coyote bands. And what that did, I'm sorry about that. We have a bit of automatic forwarding problem here. What that did was that instead of the dominant pair, the alpha pair breeding only, all the young coyotes would breed too. And so you would increase the number of coyote offspring. That helped fuel the spread of coyotes throughout the plains, throughout the eastern United States, all the way up into northeastern Canada. And of course, wolves have long been the target of the livestock industry. You only have to look at the pages of today's magazines and newspapers to see the livestock industry's ongoing and continuing fight against the recovery of wolves in places like Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, where the livestock industry has used its political influence to have really anti-wolf and wolf eradication policies that threaten the survival of wolves. Elsewhere in the United States, we have federal protections on the Endangered Species Act, and that limits a lot more what the livestock industry can do to kill off the species of native wildlife. But in Wyoming, you may all have heard of Cody Roberts, who famously ran over a wolf with a snowmobile and then taped its mouth shut, took it into a bar, and paraded it in front of his friends so he could take social media photos. This idea of snowmobile whacking is currently legal in Wyoming and is also practiced in Idaho and maybe in other states as well. And it's allowed by the state governments. There is no law against it in Wyoming. Currently, there's a bill to make it illegal. That bill has been defeated in legislature after legislature in the past. And interestingly, the livestock industry has insisted, it's been the lead group trying to push to keep the snowmobile whacking legal. Quote from Jim Magagna, the chief lobbyist for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. I've talked with a number of livestock producers across the state, in particular sheep producers, who have said they view it, he's talking about snowmobile whacking, as one of their most effective tools. So for the livestock industry, running over wolves and coyotes with snow machines is not wildlife abuse. It is one of their most important tools. And that shows you the kind of sick mindset in which the livestock industry thinks it is entitled to wipe out and abuse any species that gets in its way. In addition, elsewhere in the United States, wolves are listed on the Endangered Species Act. The livestock industry has managed to get a whole federal program there to compensate ranchers whenever they lose stock to wolves. So if you can prove that your cow or your sheep was taken by a wolf, then the federal government has what's called a livestock indemnity program that will give you the fair market value of these wolves. Well, one of the things that the ranchers have figured out how to do is how to cheat the system and how to inflate and create fraudulent claims for these depredations. And New Mexico, Western Watersheds Project was able to launch an investigation through the Freedom of Information Act, and also with the assistance of some former Wildlife Services personnel that were USDA personnel that were involved in the fraudulent behavior, that were leaking us information. And we were able to blow this out into the open and show that there was a considerable amount of fraud in these livestock indemnity program payments, and that ranchers were getting paid by wolves that were, just died of natural causes, probably in many cases. And certainly there was no evidence to implicate wolves. And then coming back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and saying, you have to kill these problem wolves that were involved in these depredations that turned out to be fraudulent. So they were using both ends of the law to both get paid a fraudulent amount of money and then have these revenge killings to wipe out the Mexican wolves. So go check this out online. It's The Intercept is the organization. The title of it's Cry Wolf. Everybody should read this to see what happened in New Mexico, because it's a similar problem that's no doubt happening everywhere across the country. Grizzly bears have been a major target of the livestock industry throughout the years. And of course, that's why they were relegated to these national parks. One of the things that the livestock industry did as an example was on the right, you see an article about the Upper Green River analysis. That was federal grazing leases that were on public lands just outside Yellowstone, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service were authorizing the killing of 72 grizzly bears on these 6 grazing leases over the course of 10 years in retribution for livestock depredations. Human killing of grizzly bears is the #1 cause of bear death. It's a completely unnatural situation, and the livestock industry is the prime culprit here. And whenever cattle and grizzly bears get tangled up, it's always the grizzly bears that are killed. And it's never the ranchers that are required to supervise their cattle when they're out there with range riders and cowboys. They don't have to take measures to minimize their stock losses. They can just throw livestock out into the backcountry and then wait for the bears to kill their animals and then get their compensation and then demand that the grizzly bears, which are on the endangered species list as a threatened species, get killed as a result. So it's almost like entrapment. USDA Wildlife Services is a government agency funded by the taxpayer whose sole job is to kill animals on behalf of the livestock industry. It's the livestock industry's, basically, it's their own death squad. And taking a look at the livestock industry's targeted species, coyotes, wolves, black bears, grizzly bears, you can see that tens of thousands of these species are getting killed every year. And all the livestock industry has to do is call up and complain. And USDA Wildlife Services will dispatch a trapper or send up a small plane with aerial gunning or put out M44 cyanide bombs or take some other action to wipe out the native wildlife at the request of the livestock producer. And the taxpayers are paying for this. Now, most of the American public strongly supports native wildlife and probably is unaware that large numbers of their native wildlife are getting killed with their own tax dollars. The livestock industry doesn't even pay for this service. It's you and me who are paying. And all of these impacts to the land, to the wildlife, to the streams, to the vegetation, what are we getting out of this? 89% of Bureau of Land Management lands in the lower 48 states are grazed by domestic livestock. More than half of national forest lands in the Western United States are grazed by domestic livestock. And what do we get for that? Well, the livestock industry is currently paying $1.69 a cow-calf pair for a month. That's less than it costs to feed a hamster. They could put their livestock out on public lands that are supposed to be managed for the benefit of all Americans and do it on the cheap. And the average cost of livestock grazing on private lands in 2019 was $23.40 an animal unit month. So they're getting a screaming discount on the backs of the taxpayer. And they're getting many other federal subsidies as well. Drought payments, disaster payments, livestock indemnity payments. There are subsidies for building fences. There are subsidies for building water facilities, all coming out of the tax coffers. Based on the figures that were developed by a University of Wyoming economist for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, it turns out that in Wyoming, public lands livestock grazing raises $213 million a year. Well, that sounds like a big number, right? That's 0.5% of the state gross domestic product in Wyoming during an oil and gas bust. That is the smallest economy in the country, I believe. And less than, or 0.5% of that economy is public lands grazing. That's how unimportant and how economically inconsequential livestock grazing really is. In Idaho, it's 0.2%. In Oregon, it's 0.05%. So Wyoming is kind of the high watermark. And if you also look at it from the standpoint of where the cattle are being produced, you think of cattle being produced in the arid lands of the American West. You all seen the cowboy movies. All public lands grazing put together makes up only 1.6% of American beef production. 1.6% of the annual animal unit months are happening on federal public land. And why is this? It's because the arid West is a terribly unproductive place to grow cattle. It's the wrong place to grow cattle. Most of the cattle are being grown in the plain states, on private lands, in the Midwestern states. If you look on this chart, you can see that there are more cattle being produced by Florida than there are by Wyoming, the cowboy state, as it's informally known. Arizona has less cattle than you see from Ohio. You know, Nevada has less cattle produced than Alabama. And it's because cattle grow best in areas with deep soils, high vegetation productivity, and and abundant precipitation. This is where cattle evolved to live. This is where they're most productive. You can have many cattle per acre in parts of the rainy East. You have to have hundreds of acres per one cow in the American West because deserts are so unsuitable for livestock production. And let's get around to climate impacts because this is a COP30 related talk. There's a really good article. There are actually two articles by Kaufman et al., one in 2022 and one in 2023. And in 2022, they took a look at the cost of grazing lands that are being charged to the ranchers, $1.69 an AUM, and looked at the cost per AUM, including the economic multipliers from that University of Wyoming NCBA study. Okay, so you're producing $27.50 to $35.21 an animal unit month in total economic production from these livestock on public lands if you consider not just the production value of the livestock themselves, but every other piece of the industry that livestock operation touches. The hay producers, the feed stores, the equipment manufacturers, and the equipment salespeople. If you put it all together, we're talking 2750 to 3521 per AUM. The social cost of carbon for those same AUMs is $72 to $166 per AUM. That's the cost that the public is absorbing in terms of disasters related to climate change that are a result of public lands livestock grazing. The public lands livestock grazing out on the open range actually has a bigger carbon footprint than raising those cattle in feedlots does. And that goes to the poor quality of forage that leads to bigger methane production. That's what's driving that. The total social cost of carbon for grazing livestock on public lands in the American West is $1.1 to $2.4 billion a year, according to this Kaufman and others study. In addition, there are collateral impacts that go far beyond that because the livestock grazing industry is insisting that these land management agencies basically turn the landscape into crop fields for production of domestic livestock. And you see large scale, what they call vegetatement treatments, as if vegetation were sick. But this is native woodlands of pinyon and juniper that are getting clear cut for the livestock industry. And it's all to produce more forage for cattle. And what tends to happen when you have a heavy juniper woodland and you take it out like this, and then you want grasses to come in, is you tend to get that invasive grass, cheatgrass. Well, the livestock grazing industry is perfectly happy to have juniper converted into cheatgrass so they can graze it that 6 months of the year when it's green, because the juniper they can't graze it at all, and it's worth nothing for the cattle. But if you have this full-fledged woodland that, almost a closed canopy, the junipers are dropping their scales on the ground, they're acidifying the soil, there's basically no understory. So when you take it out, you have a fertile, degraded and damaged area that is perfect for the invasion of cheatgrass. And that's what you get from these heavy woodlands. So this is happening across hundreds of thousands of acres, sometimes millions of acres in the American West, and it's all for cattle production. Here you see one of the methods called chaining, in which two bulldozers drag an anchor chain from a Navy ship or other large commercial vessel through the pinyon and juniper and just tear out the trees by their roots, and just then they pile them and burn them. It's just an ecological disaster. From a climate perspective, this is deforestation, just like you see in the Amazon. That carbon stock that used to be in junipers and pinyons is now being burned and going up into the atmosphere. It's a pretty major carbon issue for the climate. Now, I promised that there'd be something about regenerative grazing, and this is a slide that I put together for an April Fool's joke, stating that the livestock industry had finally discovered a way to have regenerative grazing, and the way to do it that they discovered was to cross domestic cattle with hummingbirds so they could hover above the land and not touch a hoof on the land, and then graft in chloroplasts, which are the photosynthetic bodies from plants, so that you have green cattle that are photosynthesizing, producing their own energy, and they don't have to graze anything. And that's truly regenerative if they could do that. That was a joke. It's not far from a truth, though. I mean, there really is no such thing as regenerative agriculture with livestock. With farming, you can do it by improving cover crops, by making more diverse types of plants that you plant, by having legumes that fix nitrogen into the soil. You can have more regenerative ways of farming. You really, the only way to have regenerative ranching is to reduce or eliminate the number of cattle and sheep. About 2013, there was a very controversial method that was promoted by um, a former mercenary from Africa named Alan Savory, called the Savory method. His idea was, gee, all we have to do is have high intensity, short duration grazing, where we have, really big dense herds of cattle or sheep or other domestic grazers, hammer the vegetation really hard and then disappear. And then we can have more cattle on the landscape, better quality vegetation, and it'll be regenerative. But it didn't work. And the range management scientists at the time debunked it. And this is a scientific review article that, in which the quote is, quote, "We find all of Mr. Savory's major claims to be unfounded, and we express deep concern that they have the potential to undermine proven, practical approaches to rangeland management and restoration that are supported by a global community of practitioners and scientists. There really is no good science showing this Savory method does anything over and above the usual methods of just throwing cattle out there and leaving them unattended. There's no advantage based on the science." This is an article from 1993, a study that started in 1983. This is 30 years before Alan Savory did his TED Talk, showing that very kind of high intensity, short rotation cattle grazing had been tested in an experimental format where you had looked at different intensities of grazing, different rotation patterns, whether it was a rotation method or it was a continuously grazed pasture. And what they found, quote, "In 1983, a pair of 25-meter transects were laid out in each continuously grazed pasture under heavy and moderate stocking, and in one paddock each of short duration, rotationally grazed pasture under heavy and moderate stocking. And, quote, grazing strategies had no effect on peak standing crop or utilization." In other words, there was no effect on vegetation productivity. There was no effect on the amount of forage that was available to the cattle. This rotational grazing idea had been debunked 30 years before by the science, before Alan Savory decided to resuscitate it and trot it out there as the savior of all native ecosystems. And so finally, I want to talk a little bit about rewilding. There is an article by Ripple and others in 2022 called "Rewilding the American West" that looks at how we restore public lands in the West. And their recipe was this: let's take these areas that we've identified for having good habitat for wolves and other large native carnivores, and let's rewild them and bring them back to their full complement of native species. And the way to do that is, number one, retire all of the livestock grazing leases. No longer rent these lands for livestock production. Number two, reintroduce the wolf and enjoy the trophic cascade of different ecological benefits that go along with that. That's a whole other complicated story that we can get into in the comments section or the questions section. But I wanted to raise that as a benefit here. And then finally, the third recipe for rewilding they had was restore the beaver, because the beaver is the keystone species of stream ecosystems. So that's a little bit of a tour of the American West and the impacts that we found there. I want to take a brief diversion out to Point Reyes National Seashore. I understand that Seed the Commons and a lot of folks on the call may be from the San Francisco Bay Area and may have a special connection to this space. So Point Reyes National Seashore is an area that had its origins in livestock ranches, both dairy and beef ranches, that were bought out by the US government in the 1960s and early 70s for fair market value. And they allowed the ranchers to stay on and leased the land back to them as a transitional method. And then ultimately that Seashore Act was amended in 1978 to guarantee every rancher that was still on the seashore the right to stay there for 25 years additionally, or the life of the original occupant. So there was a real effort by Congress to allow these ranchers to continue to lease these same lands and continue their livestock operations for many decades after the lands were sold and became part of Point Reyes National Seashore and were then the property of the National Park Service. Now, by the 20 teens, it became obvious that many of these ranchers wanted to stay forever. And the idea that they were never going to transition on, we were never going to see the seashore come back to a natural native coastal prairie became severely concerning. And so a number of conservation groups got together and filed a lawsuit to try and force change. In Point Reyes, some of the things that you may be familiar with, they have a lot of seabirds, and including the rare snowy plover that are out on Point Reyes National Seashore. They have marine mammals that haul up and breed and have their pups on Point Reyes National Seashore. They have herds of the very rare Thule elk, which were reintroduced on Point Reyes National Seashore, most of which were being penned up in Tamales Point, which was an elk reserve. And this is a species that once disappeared down to 6 individuals left in the world. And there was a place on private lands, on private ranch lands, that saved the last 6 from that. That became the seed stock for all the Thule elk that are left today. And some of them got transplanted to Point Reyes National Seashore. So this is a place for Thule elk. There were originally tens of thousands of them up and down the California coast. Other species of terrestrial wildlife as well. It's just a great place to go and see wildlife. But also, there are cattle that are still continuing to be ranched on Point Reyes National Seashore, and those are transitioning out now under the terms of a settlement that we have in our lawsuit. The founding statutes of Point Reyes National Seashore was that it was established for the purposes of public recreation, benefit, and inspiration, to be managed, quote, without impairment of its natural values in a manner which provides for such recreational, educational, historic preservation, interpretation, and scientific research opportunities as are consistent with, based upon, and supportive of the maximum protection, restoration, and preservation of the natural environment within the area. And Golden Gate National Recreation Area is also involved in this issue. It was established, quote, to preserve for public use and enjoyment certain areas possessing outstanding natural, historic, scenic, and recreational values. And the secretary, quote, shall preserve the recreation area as far as possible in its natural setting and protect it from development and uses which would destroy the scenic beauty and natural character of the area. Okay, that was the legal marching orders that Congress set forth for Point Reyes National Seashore and Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But what was happening? Well, here's a picture of a liquefied manure truck taking manure from one of the dairy operations and spreading it on the hillsides of Point Reyes National Seashore. We had concentrated animal feeding operations for the production of dairy products. We had beef ranching happening out in this area. We had ranches that were polluting the stream, some of the most polluted streams with the biggest Clean Water Act violations in California were found on Point Reyes National Seashore. Here on the right, you see a photograph of some of the manure piles that were, produced by one of the ranches. There were serious problems with water quality. We were able to document them. The Park Service itself was able to document them. Major E. coli contamination issues, and also the cattle in this area are infected with what's called Johne's disease, which causes a form of colitis in humans that can be potentially deadly. So the visitors to the seashore that were going to the beach and maybe wading in some of these stream lagoons or being exposed to this contamination. The Clean Water Act violations that were reported started in 2013, where a National Park Service report showed exceedances of fecal coliform standards. In 2021, there was an independent report that found elevated fecal coliform and enterococci contamination from both beef and dairy cattle operations that both exceeded the standards of the Clean Water Act and had imminent human health risks. And finally, in 2022, another independent report was done finding that fecal coliform contamination were at levels 170 times the allowable legal standard, and that wading, swimming, and kayaking in Kehoe Lagoon and Drake Sestero results in an unacceptable human health risk. So there was a big problem in terms of public safety on Point Reyes. And you had these elk that were trapped on Tamales Point behind this 8-foot tall game fence. It was a small area. I think it's about 1,800 acres. It had a few small ponds that dried up in the driest, drought-prone years. And when those ponds dried up, the elk got desperate trying to find water to survive and would get mired in the mud and would die in these mud holes that were the only freshwater source left in Tamales Point. And the National Park Service refused to allow these elk to get out of the enclosures so they could get to water supplies that they naturally would have been able to access before the arrival of agriculture on Point Reyes. But because the livestock industry was so intent on keeping Thule elk out of quote unquote their pastures, these elk, the bulk of the Thule elk on the national seashore, were fenced up behind this enclosure, and they were dying by the hundreds whenever there was a drought, whether it was due to water stress, whether it was due to starvation. Also, there's known fact that Tamales Point doesn't have enough copper in the soils to be suitable for, in terms of the nutritional needs of the elk. That was a major problem that was on Point Reyes National Seashore. And of course, you had overgrazing on Point Reyes National Seashore. And this is a photograph that I took a few years ago at one of the dairy operations. You can see this is in October. By the end of the year, the cattle have grazed this area down to bare soil. And when you do that, what happens the next spring is you get invasive weeds replacing all the native grasses, just like you do in the interior West. It's a different suite of weeds. It's mostly Italian ryegrass. And in this photo, these large clumps that look like some kind of vegetative cancer are milk thistle. That's a non-native weed. So you get these cattle pastures on Point Reyes National Seashore stretching for tens of thousands of acres that don't have, it's hard to even find a single native plant left on them. They're entirely native weeds. They have been so debilitated. And so, in response to our initial lawsuit, the Park Service signed a settlement that said they were going to issue a new general management plan, and that offered the public a chance to weigh in. Interestingly, the conventional wisdom was the public supports local, organic, locavore food production on Point Reyes. They want to see the livestock stay. But what we found when we counted the comments were that 91.4% of the public comments opposed any continued ranching on the national seashore, and 94.2% of the public comments endorsed alternative F, which was the alternative of ending all livestock grazing forever on Point Reyes National Seashore. So the public was strongly behind getting rid of the livestock on Point Reyes National Seashore. And, for different people, that might have been for different reasons, right? Some people were vegans and were just opposed to the idea of raising cows for beef and dairy on public lands. Some of the people were animal welfare people that were offended that the Thule elk were being killed and excluded from their native habitats because of the livestock. Some of the people were ecologists and people that were focused on native ecosystems that were appalled at the fact that you can't have native coastal grasslands anymore. Anyway, the public came up strongly in favor of getting rid of the livestock on Point Reyes, but instead of doing that, the Park Service doubled down on livestock and even expanded some of the things that livestock producers were able to do. So in 2022, our organization, as well as two others, Resource Renewal Institute and Center for Biological Diversity, filed a lawsuit challenging once again the idea that the livestock grazing was not consistent with the legislation establishing the national seashore, that that the agency wasn't looking at the impacts of Tule elk, and that they were authorizing livestock grazing at levels that were violating the Clean Water Act. And in December of 2024, the Park Service announced its own decision to take down the Tule elk fence and let the elk loose on Tomales Point. That was a major interim victory that happened before the settlement was inked. And then shortly thereafter, there was a settlement in which the ranchers were given the opportunity to sell their ranches for fair market. Well, it wasn't fair market value. They were selling their leases again after they had already been, had been bought out at fair market value. But very generous. We're learning terms that the Nature Conservancy was able to give these ranchers to have them transition out of the national seashore. The amounts of these payouts are still not fully known. That was between the Nature Conservancy and the ranchers. We don't know. We haven't seen how much money they were given, but this was private money. This wasn't tax money. So it's a private transaction between a private organization and private ranchers. So we don't have any problem with that. And the ranchers were given an additional 15 months to wind down their ranching operations and depart. And in April, in theory, the last of those ranches that accepted the buyout will go. And then there are two ranchers that elected to stay, and they will get to stay and continue in commercial ranching under the terms of the settlement. It was a compromise. Nobody got whatever everything that they wanted. And the remaining ranchers get 20-year leases, but under more restrictive terms. But they get some additional authorized activity. So it's a mixed bag. And the environmental groups, we dismissed our lawsuit and said we won't challenge the same decision in the future, although we maintain our right to bring a future lawsuit against a new action on Point Reyes. We won't litigate the general management plan that is currently in effect, even though it does allow some cattle or other domestic livestock onto Point Reyes National Seashore for the purposes of restoration. We're going to be monitoring that very closely, of course. And this is the map. On the left, you see all of the commercial cattle and sheep operations on Point Reyes National Seashore and that part of Golden Gate National Recreation Area that's adjacent. Before the settlement, the brown and tan areas were grazed by domestic livestock. On the right, you see the purple areas are the areas where the ranches have accepted buyouts, and commercial livestock grazing will end forever in those areas under the terms of the settlement. These green areas, commercial livestock operations get to continue. And so that is the two ranches in 3 units on Point Reyes National Seashore, and also these areas of Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So our hope is that we can have the restoration of native coastal grasslands. We can have the return and expansion of Tule elk, which is the native herbivore on Point Reyes National Seashore. And here's a little relict bunchgrass area of Idaho fescue and other native plants that we found in an area that the cattle couldn't get to. We hope to see the restoration of these very rare native coastal grasslands throughout Point Reyes National Seashore, and we'll be watching very closely to make sure it happens. And more globally, I think if you look at it, from a West-wide standpoint, this is a painting that was commissioned by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation by a Chippewa artist by the name of Charles Hilliard Sekawagan, called "Reversing Manifest Destiny." This is a good model of what it would look like if we could reverse all of the dominionism and all of the agricultural attitude towards public lands, and rewild and renaturalize and maybe even re-indigenize the public lands in some way to have healthy native ecosystems again. And it's important to note that in North America and the American West in particular, we had really healthy native ecosystems for 20 plus thousand years under human habitation from indigenous people. It was only when my forebears, the white people, came west with their Conestoga wagons and their herds of cattle that the ecosystems were destroyed, that the buffalo were killed, that the wolves and grizzly bears were driven extinct, that the ecosystems collapsed, that the cheatgrass invaded. This happened under under the jackboot of agricultural repression, degenerative ranching, and white management of the land. Let's get back to the wisdom and intelligence of letting the natural ecosystems manage themselves because nature does a far better job than we do. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was really very interesting, and I'm very excited to get to the questions. I first want to make a comment, and also, I don't know, there's a lot going on in the chat, so I don't know if you'll be able to read everything. And so, in case you can't, I just wanted to read you a comment that Rhonda Dern made, which is, "Words cannot express my eternal gratitude to you, Eric." So
Well,
that's
it's my privilege to get to fight for the natural world and to try and get healthy native ecosystems to be regenerated. That's my job, and it's great to be paid to do this. I mean, it really is a privilege to be able to do this work. And when I went through my training as a biologist at the bachelor's level and getting my master's degree, I thought I wanted to go into one of these federal or state agencies and directly manage wildlife or directly manage lands. And I ended up in, quite by accident, in nonprofit conservation instead and conservation advocacy. And now I look at my classmates that did go into these state and federal agencies, and they're working in these toxic bureaucratic environments where they have to go along to get along and don't make waves and don't do anything that will offend these politically influential and privileged demographics like the livestock industry or the logging industry or the oil and gas industry. They can't do their jobs. They're not even allowed to speak the truth. And so it's up to me and those like me in the conservation community and the nonprofits that need to speak out on behalf of all of these poor folks who are stuck in these agencies, basically muzzled.
Before I read some of the questions, I just wanted to address something that was said in the comments. Um, basically saying that when there were, protests and comments and, all of this activity going around in Point Reyes, that these were sort of paid folks who came from the outside. Now, as I said at the beginning, for a while we kind of we were doing other things. We weren't active as Heed the Commons, so we spoke quite a bit about Point Reyes starting when we started organizing conferences back in 2015. And then for a certain while we weren't involved. So I can't really say categorically whether there is any truth to that or not. But what I can say is that we used to speak about this at various events. And in 2018, I was part of a coalition of San Francisco-based organizations that was organizing a climate march that was going to take place in September in San Francisco. And we were organizing the climate march, and I was also organizing the farmers contingent of that climate march. So the contingent that would sort of bring attention to the role of agriculture in climate change. And so we did a lot of things sort of leading up to that organizing, to that event, to that march in September. One of the events that we did, was in the mission in San Francisco, and we spoke about all of these issues. And one of the things that we touched upon was Point Reyes. At that specific event in the mission, there was somebody who learned about Point Reyes that night. I know this person. She lives in San Francisco. She became very interested in the issue and she started activating and organizing around that. So I can say, because I was there, that I know that this organizer was from SF, and she sort of reached out to people who are in the North Bay. And, she put in a lot of work and she would go to local events. And so she really activated people that were local to there and let them know about this issue. So I know that because I was there when this person learned about that. I saw how interested she was. I saw that she started putting in a lot of work and that she was connecting with people who were local to the area to build awareness, to motivate them to go out and speak. So, were there other people? I really can't say, but what I can say is that I saw that there were many local people who got involved and who got interested at that point. So,
Yeah,
all
and
right.
if I
Yeah.
could add a little, I'm aware of at least a dozen individual volunteer groups that sprung up at different times throughout this Point Reyes event all over the Bay Area and Marin County. And these weren't paid protesters. These were just local people who cared. You don't have to pay people to care about Tule elk. You don't have to pay people to care about a National Park Service unit. You don't have to pay people to care about their environment because people just care. And quite frankly, the San Francisco Bay Area, the idea that there are actually environmentally minded people in San Francisco, I mean, that's hardly very surprising, right? I mean, that's a really real hotbed for environmentalism. So, I mean, I think it's a silly assertion to say that people were paid to send in comments. But if somebody wants to bring forth some evidence that somebody somewhere was ever paid for a comment, then they probably would have a news story.
So yeah, so we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start reading through a few and all right. So let's go back to the top. Um, so I'm gonna group in a couple of Anita Leahy's, actually I'll group in three of her. Well, she has three that I'll read, and you can see what you have time to take and what you don't. I thought ungulates were browsers and cattle were grazers. Are they really competing for the same resources? Also, we don't vaccinate bighorn, and so WWP's goal is to end allotments on public lands, correct? This does not impact private lands at all.
Um, yeah, we'll start with the first one. Ungulates are any animal, these are herbivores primarily, that's running on its toenails. That's what ungulate means. Unguligrade means you're running on your toenails. So hoofed animals, that's the deer family, and it's the cattle family, the bovids. And in North America, the biggest, most numerous native grazer was the bison, and that was absolutely 100% a grass-eating grazer. Horses are primarily grazers, but also are browsers. Browsers meaning eating woody vegetation. Elk preferentially will graze, but also will eat woody vegetation. So they're facultative grazers and browsers. And east of the Rocky Mountains, they tend to be more grazers. West of the Rocky Mountains, especially in the moister parts of the northern Rockies, they tend to be more browsers and woody vegetation eaters. And moose are almost entirely browsers. So each different animal has its own niche and its own specialized diet. In a natural system, you have what's called segregation in space and time, and resource partitioning, which is a fancy way of saying these animals have evolved to have different specialties from each other, so they often don't compete directly with each other. But when you put cattle out on the landscape, they're going straight for the grasses, and cattle, interestingly, are very selective grazers. And what that means is they tend to graze out their favorites first and then go on to their next favorites instead of just eating everything equally. And so, what that means functionally in the interior West is the native perennial bunch grasses are the most palatable and most nutritious that the cattle always graze out first. So, if you ever get cheatgrass invasions, and cheatgrass, when it's dead and dry, has very little nutritional value, and the cattle don't like to eat it because it has that sharp seed heads that get stuck in their mouths and eyes. They will go and browse out the 2% of native grasses that are left before they'll go for the cheatgrass. So it's not very effective to have cattle grazing on cheatgrass. I'm not aware that anybody is trying to inoculate bighorn sheep against mycoplasma or Mannheimia. I don't think that there's a vaccine for those for bighorn sheep yet, but not that I've heard of. And then, in terms of WWP's mission, we're not trying to end all livestock grazing on all public lands. What we would like to do is have livestock grazing reduced to the point where it no longer has a significant environmental impact. Now, currently, livestock are grazing 65, sometimes more than that, percent of the vegetation, sometimes 50%. The range management textbooks say the maximum should be 25 or 30% in the arid West. That's for cattle production, not for ecological health. If you want to have ecological health and no impacts, you have to have a lot less than that. You would have to have a major reduction in livestock densities in order to get to a place, if you could prove it at all, where your cattle are not having an impact. So it would be a major change for how livestock operations do business on public lands for them to have to get along with healthy native ecosystems. But that's where we set the bar. We don't do much with private land because, number one, federal laws don't really apply very much to private land. And number two, philosophically and traditionally, private landowners have the privilege of doing pretty much what they want on private lands in the United States. So it's very, very hard to enforce, what people do on their own private lands. We think that if there's going to be beef production, it ought to be on private lands that those ranchers own themselves, not on public lands that belong to basically all of us.
So, a question by Lori Ford. What is the driving force behind the livestock industry, Cattlemen's Association, protecting public lands ranchers when the opposition is so strong? And sorry, the bead, the what?
Beef, probably.
Oh, oh, right, right, yeah. Beef contribution so minimal.
I think it's a symbolic fight for the beef industry. Quite frankly, if the beef industry was managing itself and saying, where should we be growing beef? The last place that they would grow beef would be in the arid West. They'd be like, this isn't even worth it. But because there are these ranching operations out in the West, and because Hollywood has glorified those with all kinds of cowboy myth, kind of glowing Americana vibes, I think the livestock industry wants to pick this as their fight because they think that the American public will be more receptive to defending the beef industry in a context where it goes along with some of that, kind of, you know, dewy-eyed history, most of which never even happened, quite frankly. I mean, the cowboy era lasted for about 10 years in the 1880s before the ranges were fenced and the cattle drives ended. That was, that part gets all the Hollywood films, but it really was a very brief part of history. And then ever after was this more boring agricultural profit-driven commodity production that is about taming the wilderness and converting native ecosystems to cattle pastures. I think you might be muted, Nassim.
Sorry. Um, all right, next question. Do you think the current administration will be successful in selling, leasing public lands? Are plans being made to address this issue?
Well, I can tell you that there are hundreds of conservation organizations that are focusing on the attempts to sell off public lands. This has been a dream of anti-federal regulation kind of libertarians for a long time. You may be familiar with the armed occupations and showdowns in Bunkerville, Nevada, and Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, where livestock interests decided that they were going to bring in armed militias and assault rifles to try and strong arm the federal government. And one of their primary philosophies is the idea that the federal government shouldn't own any public land and all that land ought to be privatized. And they've got all kinds of right-wing think tanks that agree with them. And they've got allies in the halls of Congress who are trying to do this. It is interesting to see, how this rolls out in states like Wyoming, which are overwhelmingly conservative and right wing, yet have people that spend a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, hiking on public lands and see. I had one union worker tell me that the public lands are the Wyoming wage that makes up for the fact that we don't get paid anything. This is their fringe benefit is to live in a place that has lots of public lands that they can have for free recreation. And that's important to most Americans. So, will the forces that want to seize and sell public lands get enough of an advantage to force the votes in Congress to make it happen, or not? And if the administration tries to do it without congressional approval, will they be able to get away with it when we drag them into court? We shall see. I mean, these are really interesting times.
Technical question. Are ranch herds autonomous feed-wise, or do ranchers have to import feed at least part of the year?
There are about 30% of the grazing allotments on public land where mostly cattle are grazing year round. But for more than two-thirds of the grazing allotments, they're only there seasonally. They're there during the grass season. And the way that they get to do this is they tend to have what they call base properties. You have to have a base property where it's supposed to be enough to winter your entire herd on that base property of private land. Now, typically, those base properties are too small to winter the entire herds that are being spread across hundreds of thousands of acres of public land. So what they do is they haul in hay, and they have what are called feed lines, where they have a hay truck that dumps hay in a line off the back, and the cattle come and feed on that all winter long. So you have your cattle herd that's out on public land in the summertime that comes to private land on the wintertime. And the subsidy is a vegetation subsidy that comes from irrigated hay fields and alfalfa fields. And one of the hidden impacts of the livestock industry is that 70+% of the water that's used for irrigation in the Colorado River and 80+% of the water that it goes into the Salt Lake Basin that is used for irrigation is going on to these cattle pasture or cattle fodder producing operations for alfalfa and hay to subsidize the cows that are out on public land in the summer. So, no, they're not self-sufficient. Yes, they are being subsidized by irrigation. That's causing water wars. That means scarcity for the larger cities in the interior West. And this whole battle over the Colorado River water that is currently raging in politics and in the media is basically driven by livestock forage production. And that taking precedence because in water rights, water is first in time, first in right. And guess who got there first? The ranchers and the homesteaders. So they are first in right, and they get in line ahead of the cities, ahead of the industries, ahead of the residential areas. They get first dibs on the water.
So it's already 11:30, 11:29. I'd like to ask Eric, would you like to extend a little bit, answer a couple more questions, or how are
Sure, sure,
people?
I can do that.
Okay. All right. So we have a few more. We have a few by Melinda, and should maybe I'll read this comment by Jennifer Wilson, and you can maybe respond to that. Your characterization of the ranchers who utilize the Upper Green River grazing allotments is unfortunate. I know for a fact that those ranchers are always actively looking for ways to mitigate grizzly conflict. They hire range riders and have worked with conservation organizations to try and find ways to minimize conflict. They say they are basically asking to say they are basically asking for it is exactly the kind of language that sets producers against conservationists.
Well, I stand by what I've said about the livestock production and the problems in the Upper Green. And let's remember, it's the U.S. Forest Service that made the decisions that are so problematic. And one of the most problematic decisions in that Upper Green analysis, which which included the killing of 72 grizzly bears in response to cattle depredations. I think there should have been zero grizzly bears killed in response to cattle depredations. Those cattle, those grizzly losses aren't grizzly losses that just naturally have to happen. They're there because of the political influence of the livestock industry and the demands to kill the grizzly bears. Okay. If the livestock industry would fully coexist in the Upper Green, they would not be seeking to have any grizzly bears killed. So that is an unfortunate reality in the Upper Green. Now, one of the hidden problems with the Upper Green is not only are you going to kill, potentially 72 grizzly bears over a 10-year span because of interactions with livestock, livestock which don't have to be grazed on public land. They can be grazed somewhere else. Um, you also have, when there is a cattle loss in the Upper Green under that decision, the ranchers aren't even required to gather up their dead cow that died from some other reason and cart it away. So it doesn't become an attractant to grizzly bears and teach those grizzly bears to eat beef. Instead, they're supposed to drag it a half a mile farther away from a road. Well, guess where grizzly bears tend to focus? Farther from a road. They avoid roads. So you're actually making the problem worse. This is a Forest Service decision that we litigated. And it's the Forest Service's responsibility to manage the things that happen on these public lands. And it was the Forest Service that um, really screwed up here and didn't do grizzly bears or the American public a very credible job of managing the livestock operations on these allotments. And if there are ranchers up there who are using range riders and who are fully coexisting with the native carnivores and not killing them and not asking for them to be killed, I think that's great, and we should have more of that.
So there are three questions by Melinda Lowe. I'm thinking maybe Eric, you could see which one you could read them and see which one you'd like to take, or we might not have time for all of them.
Well, biological controls for cheatgrass. There are some natural head smuts, which are pathogens that attack cheatgrass that have been tried. They aren't practical for large scale application, unfortunately. They do reduce cheatgrass seed propagation, but cheatgrass is a really prolific seed producer. And you can knock out 2/3 of the cheatgrass seed production and still have way too many cheatgrass seeds that fully allow a full scale invasion. That's one of the problems there. Um, in terms of range riders, I think that's a really important thing. And I think we ought to be seeing more of that. I don't think we should have cattle that are left unattended in areas that have large carnivores. I think that the responsible thing to do is for the livestock industry to supervise its own livestock. And there is a ranch called the Bee Bar, which is in the Tom Miner Basin outside of Yellowstone National Park, that uses a special breed of cattle that groups itself up and defends itself. And that I have been to the bee bar and I have viewed 7 grizzly bears in the same pasture as these cattle, and there aren't any problems. It can be done. You're muted again.
Yeah, so I think we're going to start wrapping up, but I want to give Eric the opportunity, maybe if there's any last comments you have, anything that you feel that, you wanted to address and weren't able to.
I think we've covered a lot today. I mean, there's so much to learn about livestock leasing on Western public lands. It's a big controversy because, quite frankly, these are multiple use lands. There are a lot of different people, including members of the public, who think that they ought to be managed for multiple uses that benefit the public. And it's not just commercial uses that are multiple uses, the timber, mining, and grazing. It's also wildlife and watersheds and public recreation that are specified in law as multiple uses. So we have to find a way to balance these different uses on public lands. And I would put it to everyone that the correct balance is the balance that maintains healthy native ecosystems and limits the extractive and commercial uses of public lands to levels that are compatible with maintaining those healthy native ecosystems.
All right. So, unfortunately, we don't have time to get to all the questions. I wanted to just remind you all that Erik Molvar has written 15 books. We have a last question here by Anita where she is asking, is there a book you would recommend that would allow us to dive deeper? Eric, maybe you can plug one of your books, but also I would recommend everybody just look him up, see what he's written. He also has some really good articles that you can just access without having to buy a book. Eric, is there any book you would recommend in particular?
The book I would recommend is not one of mine. It's if you want to learn more about these issues, I think the best book to read is This Land by Christopher Ketchum. Is the one that's really the definitive book on diving into the problems with federal land management in the interior West. And If you're interested in reading some of my scientific publications, they can be found on Google Scholar.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up. So, I'm very grateful to Erik for being here today. I'm very grateful for everyone who has participated and asked questions and commented. And obviously, there is a lot of disagreement around this topic. We weren't able to get to everything. This is something that, if you feel that your question wasn't answered, we didn't get to everything, we could talk about this again in the future. It's not the first time we speak about these issues, and we can come back to them. So let me know. And another thing that I'd like to know maybe is the first webinar of this series that was Saturday, last Saturday. We had Spanish English interpretation because we had speakers from Latin America. But I'd like to know if that's something that would be useful for people going forward. So if you want to email us and let us know that there was a topic we didn't touch upon that we should go more into it. Also, let us know if you think that maybe people who would come if there were interpretation, if this is something that we should be doing more going forward. All right. So again, this webinar is part of a series that we're doing as a sort of follow-up to our participation in the People's Summit Towards COP30. And when we started out as an organization, our message was, and it still is, that we need to transition away from industrial agriculture to agroecology. But what is a bit unique about our voice is that we started asking the question, can we do agroecology in a non-pastoral way? And back in 2014, 2015, it was quite difficult to find people who were sort of farming in that way, but without animal husbandry. And one of the people that we found was Helen Athow. And so Helen is the speaker tomorrow. She actually grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana, I believe. Yeah, I think she grew up in Montana on a cattle ranch. She became a farmer. She was first a sort of, traditional organic farmer and then transitioned to a more agroecological approach. And now she has a non-pastoral vegan agroecological approach and has recently written a book called The Ecological Farm. So for me, these topics really go together because, there is this myth of regenerative grazing, and this word regenerative over the past 10, 15 years has really become a buzzword. But I actually think that it has value because I do think that we can look to agriculture as a means of not only social transformation and not only not only thinking in terms of, okay, how can we emit less, how can we reduce our emissions, but also how can we truly have an agriculture that allows us to regenerate our ecosystems. That is actually a good focus to have that I think that we got from the regenerative grazing folks, and we can expand that into just thinking about regeneration more broadly speaking, which is why the title of this webinar series is Regeneration and Next Steps and Follow-up from COP30. So tomorrow we have this webinar with Helen Athow, who will speak about how should we actually grow food. And donations are always helpful to help us do our work. And if you donate $25 or more, you can ask us to send you this tote bag, which hopefully you can see. Let me put it in a way that, okay, you should be able to see. So more grazing to heal the planet? Nope. All right. So I'll let everyone go now. Thank you again, Erik.
Thank you so much for having me, Nassim.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. See you tomorrow.